Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Each episode, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to the Indie Pub. Today's guest is Trudie Skies, author of the Cruel Gods series, starting with the 13th Hour, as well as the YA Sanddancer series, including Sanddancer and Firewalker. They're here with us to talk about video games as an influence in our storytelling. But before we dive in, tell us a bit about what we're drinking here in the pub today.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you for having me on the show. This is very exciting.
Absolutely.
Today we're going to be drinking the most sophisticated of all drinks, which is Monster Energy.
Oh, yeah.
Very sophisticated, very classy. Because nothing goes better with video games and energy drinks, in my opinion. They're kind of like two peas in a pod. Coffee is usually the drink of choice for most authors, but like energy drinks, kind of the same, right?
Yeah. It's just there's more fruity notes involved with the energy drinks.
Exactly. So I've got here a zero sugar Monster Energy Ultra Fiesta Mango. It's mango flavored, basically. Very posh. It's I really like the designs that they put on these cans. Obviously, you won't be able to see the designs, but it's all like pretty and turquoisey, and I suppose that's how to get you with the marketing. Yeah. Make it look nice and cool, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm cool drinking this. But of course I am cool drinking this, just so you know. Very cool.
Yeah, I've got the Mango Loco version of Monster. It's the juiced version, I guess, whatever that means.
Oh, I like the juiced ones. They're quite nice.
Yeah. So this is same thing, turquoise can. So we'll get to talk about the finer details and finer points between the two versions of their mango offerings.
Of course.
All right, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Okay, I'm a British author living in northeast England by the coast, lots of seagulls. I have a degree in video game design production, and I previously worked for a mobile game company. And that's kind of what convinced me to start writing books instead, because the game industry is just crazy. So I've published my young adult fantasy series for a small press, and now I'm self-publishing adult fantasy, starting with the 13th Hour, which is the first book in the Cruel Gods series, and that's a gas lamp fantasy featuring magical portals, gothic cosmic deities, quaint Britishisms, and steampunk vibes.
Nice. So to start off with, what kind of gamer are you? Are we talking God of War, Skyrim, Pokemon, Candy Crush, or all of it? What are some of your favorite games?
I've been honestly gaming since the 8-bit days. My first ever video game was Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm a bit of a Sega fan, Sega nerd. I saw the Sonic 2 movie like last week, I think it was.
Nice.
So yeah. Been there, done that. I pretty much owned all consoles at one point or another, though nowadays I'm strictly a PC gamer. I'm a huge Bethesda fan as well, so The Elder Scrolls, Fallout, they're some of my favourite series. I've literally got a whole week booked off of work for Starfield when that comes in November, so any book stuff I have to do has to be done before then. Cannot interfere with Starfield.
What kind of game is Starfield?
It's going to be like a cross between Skyrim and Fallout, but in space. I don't know if you've heard of The Outer Worlds. It's going to be a bit like that.
Okay, so kind of one of the massive map type games?
Yes, nice. But in space.
That's cool.
It's going to be space and spacey stuff. It's going to be awesome. But yeah, I pretty much play anything except FIFA because I don't really give a crap about football, unfortunately. Yeah. Like being British. So yeah, favourite games are RPGs like Skyrim, Final Fantasy, old school RPGs, MMOs. Right now I'm playing Elden Ring. Still playing that.
I've heard that people are loving it, but that it's frustratingly hard. Is that correct?
Well, I was kind of put off from like the Dark Souls type games because I've heard that they're incredibly hard, and it's like I don't play games just to be completely bamboozled by them. I just want to chill and have fun. I don't want to be screaming and throwing stuff at the walls. But actually, Elden Ring is not that bad. It's quite accessible.
Oh, that's good.
I would say it's like, I mean, I say that I'm stuck on a boss at the moment that is actually kicking my ass, but in a good way, you know? It's not too bad.
No, and I understand that feeling. When I was in college, my back so this would have been like 02 to 04, 06. My video game handle was fodder. You know, playing Halo with my friends just because I'd be the one to run out front and die so that they could actually play the game.
That's harsh.
Yeah, well, it was the truth. That's where my skill set lies. Okay, so thinking about these games that are your favorites, what is it about those games that really draw you in?
I think it's really the world building and the sense of adventure, especially from RPGs, that sense of going in a whole new world, exploring it and saving it most of the time. I think what draws me to most games is the world building, especially if it explores like a unique setting or looks at the world a bit differently, because games tend to be quite creative in that regard. So I wouldn't say I'm good at first-person shooters, but FPS games, they have some of the most unique and interesting world building, I think. Their world and set pieces were always kind of quite unique or fascinating. There was a Bethesda one. Can't even think of the name now. What was it called? It will come back to me eventually. But I just love exploring these worlds. I mean, even Fallout, like, it's technically not an FPS, but it is kind of an FPS RPG. And the world for that is just so vast, and there's just so much detail that goes into these worlds. It's definitely all about the world building.
Yeah.
The same thing draws me to read and write fantasy books. It's just unique worlds that I love to explore and read about, often with rules that are just completely different from our own.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so for books in general, do you find that it's that world building that really is the main piece that draws you?
Definitely draws me in first, because if a world sounds really interesting and unique, it's like I've got to kind of experience it. And that kind of comes first to draw me in, but then what keeps me in the book is probably the characters more than the plot. If the characters are fascinating and interesting, then that keeps me. But if the characters, no matter if the world's interesting or the plot's interesting, if the characters aren't quite there, it makes me lose interest in the book. Yeah,
and I find that too. And I think I find that for video games too. I'm trying to think of some of my favorites in the past. Like probably my absolute pinnacle video game was BioShock.
Oh yes,
that game is so good.
I love those.
And then the Batman Arkham games I really loved.
Yeah,
and a lot of that is that world building that are really immersive. You know, you feel like you have to match the lights in the room to the game to make it all one space.
Yeah.
So do you think that there are, other than just world building, are there other aspects of games and books that parallel each other?
Well, I think games and books have a lot in common. Both can be used to tell a story, to explore a world and overcome the obstacles. Storytelling has become more important in games these days, leading to kind of more cinematic games, more cinematic experiences. There's a lot more interactive stories in games now that focus heavily on narration and player choices. Those have been really quite popular for a while, especially in the indie scene. There's a lot of indie games that are like that. And traditional action games, a lot of them now hire professional writers. GTA 5, for example, had professional script writers from Hollywood, I believe.
Oh, wow.
And that, I mean, if you've played GTA 5, the story in there is definitely quite high quality Hollywood style, so you can kind of see the influences. But they kind of differ in the sense that games obviously focus on the game mechanics, where the story is built around the game mechanics rather than the other way around. So like when you're reading a book, you don't need to defeat a boss to unlock the next chapter of a book, which with a game, obviously, you need to kind of reach certain milestones in order to move forward in the story of that game. And if you can't do it, then, well, tough luck, I guess.
Yeah.
But obviously with a game, you've got like many branching side plots and characters, which you might not necessarily be able to fit within a book because you're constrained by the genre to a point, and you're also constrained by word count. You can't really just go on and on for 100 hours like you can with Elden Ring, for example, which I have. I mean, games, they need to condense information and convey it in a way that's easy to follow, which is something that honestly some authors could benefit from when editing.
Yeah.
But games are also really good for telling a story through the environment, like for setting the atmosphere and the tone in like less words than an author will need. So for a game, it's like the whole package tells the story. you've got the atmosphere, the sound, the graphics, whereas obviously with a book, it's just right down to you kind of creating that atmosphere yourself through your words.
Absolutely. Yeah, I find that one way I will use video games as influence for my books is kind of deciding what details I'm going to include. Because I think about like if I'm playing a first person video game, what are the details that are there? Basically, they've purposely made stand out for me to see and to interact with and to use. And my mind kind of goes there as I'm writing to think about, what are the things I'm going to, what's going to have the little sparkle like they'll do in the game or something like that makes you walk over there, or just draws your mental eye, I guess.
I definitely. It's a lot harder, I think, to try and visualize on the page than it is to put a visual in a game or a film, for example.
For sure. So thinking about the more cinematic games and kind of the more story-rich games, what are some of your favorite storylines from games you've played?
Oh, there's so many good ones these days. I mean, we've mentioned BioShock, which definitely is up there, in GTA. There's also things like Deus Ex, Mass Effect, Final Fantasy, The Witcher. I would say that all of these kind of like AAA games are really quite cinematic now with their storytelling. There's a few that I haven't got around to playing yet that I've heard amazing things about, and that's Horizon, Red Dead Redemption 2, and The Last of Us. I mean, the great thing about these is that they're getting like nominated for awards and things like that, like BAFTAs, specifically aimed at game writing, and these games are kind of like knocking it out of the park.
And so what do you think, what are some of the main details that make these games, the stories in these games, so successful?
I think for me personally, it comes down to, again, the characters and how the characters are acting. But also I think like it comes down to the emotion as well. Some of my favorite game stories aren't necessarily the big AAA ones, but things like the indie games like Bastion, Hades, To the Moon, Undertale, Papers, Please. A lot of these don't rely on graphics to get the story across. They kind of focus on the characters and how the characters react, as well as emotions. I mean, some of them are little more than interactive stories or walking simulators, because Hades is basically a roguelike, but what makes that unique is the ongoing storyline and the relationship between the characters. I don't know if you've ever played To the Moon. It's a cute little indie game. It was made in RPG Maker. As a game, it's quite boring. There's not really much to it, but the story has so much emotional depth to it. It's literally one of the few games that have made me cry. It's just that emotional. It's so good. But even Papers, Please, which is quite simple, it kind of tells a dystopian story in the background. So I think like games with good stories give us a reason to feel invested in the world and to care about the characters, and I think oddly enough that's what makes a good book. All
right, so let's pop to our drink.
Right. Here we go.
So every episode we always talk about taste and smell because they're the two most overlooked senses in writing.
It's true.
So with our delightfully sophisticated Monster Energy drink, what are some of the notes you're picking up? What are some of those tastes and flavors and smells that really pop out as you're drinking it?
Right, let's get it in a glass to be sophisticated.
Oh, of course.
With a straw to be even more sophisticated.
Oh, there we go. Nice.
It's a very mango. Is yours also very mango?
It is, yeah. It's got... This one feels kind of like it has actual, like, how would you put it? Like, I don't know if they have this in the UK or not, but if in the US, at least, if you go to, like, a really good traditional Mexican restaurant, they'll have these, they call them fruit nectars, I think, where it's kind of like a fruit juice in a can, but really thick and syrupy.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
It's really good. And this tastes like they had the normal mango Monster drink and then just added some of that on top.
So it's like a mixture of the juice and then the kind of energy magic mixed in with that.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
How about yours?
Well, mine being the sugar-free version is probably not as sweet as yours.
Yeah.
But you can still definitely get the mango flavor. It's very crisp. It's very refreshing. I can feel the energy building up inside me.
Nice. Getting your power-ups?
Exactly. In terms of smell, since we've neglected the smell, smells like mango.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very fruity.
Yeah, this one for sure. They do a good job with the kind of vitamin-y aspect of energy drinks. I feel like with this one, it's there still, but it's not like, oh, you're taking your vitamins plus it's a drink. It's very drink first, and then it has just that little extra.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why I like the Monster varieties compared to other energy drinks, because I'm obviously a junkie here. But some energy drinks just taste a bit like battery acid. Not that I would know battery acid, but to compare, it just don't taste kind of nice. Where this tastes like a drink that you want to drink, and it just happens to be an energy drink at the same time. I just like the taste. I know they're not the healthiest of drinks. Definitely not. You shouldn't be drinking multiple at a time, but then you shouldn't be drinking multiple coffees either. So, you know.
That's true. I'm definitely guilty of that.
I think a lot of authors are.
Okay, so let's talk specifically about the video game inspiration in your work. So I know that you definitely do draw quite a bit of video inspiration from video games. Do you find that you're pulling from multiple types and multiple genres of video games, or do you get most of that inspiration from one main category?
I'd say it's mostly RPGs for me, as well as FPSs that I kind of draw because, as I mentioned before, the world building and also the sense of adventure. Open world games in general are really great for inspiration in terms of world building because they have the vast worlds you can explore. Games like Tomb Raider and Uncharted as well, I think, kind of bridge that inspirational exploration type thing. But I think when it comes to video games, you can obviously draw inspiration from various different aspects. Like you might be playing an RPG and draw inspiration from that RPG system, and then a different game has some cool ideas for the world. Just kind of like mix and mash those.
And what, in your own work, without getting too spoilery, what aspects of your work definitely benefited from some of this video game inspiration?
Definitely kind of the world building when creating the world that I did. So for my young adult series, Sandancer, there was a few elements from video games there. Notably, the world was inspired by some of my favorite old school RPGs. Like, I stole some of the names and kind of rewrote them a little bit. So there was kind of a lot of inspiration from there.
Nice.
In my young adult series as well, the fighting style in that book is like a sword fighting dancing style, and that was 100% inspired by Soul Calibur.
Oh, nice.
Because of the way that the characters kind of, some of them dance when they fight. So I just totally stole it from that.
I loved Soul Calibur. I loved the character creator in Soul Calibur. I was never very good at actually playing the game, but I spent hours, building a Batman character or building a werewolf character or something.
I made my character in that as well, just to complete the cycle,
Oh, of course. So speaking of that then, was it kind of just the more rhythmic dance style fighting in general from Soul Calibur, or were there specific characters, and what aspects of those specific characters did you decide to take for the story?
There were specific characters that definitely inspired the style. Huang and Xianghua were the two ones that kind of like do a little bit of a dance when they fight. So specifically those two.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And thinking about the inspiration on your world building, is it structural, or is it more of a kind of a mentally visual scene setting inspiration, a mix of those, something else?
I'd say a bit of both. In the 13th Hour, there's definitely elements of Final Fantasy world building in there, from the mix of magic and technology in certain games like Final Fantasy VII, to the various races and the gods which rule over. That's kind of like a staple for Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VII has Midgar, the city with the different plates, and I've got that in the 13th Hour, where the city has different plates. And who knows, maybe one of them will fall down one day, who knows. But anyway, I also took kind of inspiration from the Elder Scrolls. Specifically, I wanted to create realms or domains that were ruled by gods, and they were definitely inspired by the Daedric princes and the Plains of Oblivion from the Elder Scrolls series. So I took like specific inspiration from that, and just kind of like it just inspired ideas like what would it like to live in a world where you had gods that ruled different domains and different realms, and how would that be? And I played a lot of Skyrim during the pandemic, the first kind of lockdown waves, as you do. And as I was playing that a lot, I was playing with this custom character that was from the Dwemer race, the Dwarven race, and they're all about clockwork and steampunk aesthetics, and that I definitely kind of took for the 13th Hour. It definitely inspired a lot of that.
And so when you're going to apply this video game inspiration, I'd like to talk a little bit about maybe some of the techniques you use, and then also when you go to add it to the story, where does it sit? Like, do you wear your inspiration on your sleeve and it's very out front and blatant, or do you find that those inspirations kind of sit more in the background in a subtle way?
That's a good question. For me, I'd say that like the video game elements do sit in the background. They inspire the world building, obviously. I think many readers probably wouldn't even notice unless they kind of play these kind of games as well. If you wanted the gaming elements to be more out front, then that's kind of like a game lit RPG kind of genre, which does exist, so that those kind of books and stories do exist. I would say that the actual kind of inspiration I take is more about the vibe and aesthetics of the world. Like you're kind of translating those vibes. So you play a video game that you really, really love. Oh yeah, Bloodborne. It's got this gothic, creepy vibes, and you kind of want to write a book that's similar. So it's kind of like you're almost translating those vibes over. There's so many video games that I kind of would like to write about based on those worlds. One of my favorite ever RPGs is called Skies of Arcadia. And that was a Sega RPG on the Dreamcast. And that's made of like floating islands, sky-based creatures, steampunk airships, sky pirates, towns, that kind of thing. And it's also kind of got like a sense of adventure and a fight for justice. It's a very happy RPG compared to most. It's not that gritty at all. And for that, I want to create my own world that's based on this sense of adventure with the sky pirates and the sky islands, but I would use my own fantasy creatures. I'd just kind of like I'd take the world that inspired Skies of Arcadia, and I'd think, okay, what kind of creatures could I have in this world, and just kind of go from there, build my own kind of rules, my own magic system, maybe take inspiration from that elsewhere. Because if another author wrote a book inspired by the same game, then we'd probably have completely different story. Would have the similar elements, would have floating islands and airships and sky pirates, but would have completely different story. Theirs might have a dragon in it, for example. But like, there's no such thing as an original story, because all stories are a combination of different influences from other stories, films, video games, sometimes a different combination of video games. Like if you took a story that was crossed between Dungeons and Dragons and a cooking simulator, then you get Legends and Lattes. And so I think it is kind of just, as I say, taking the vibes and just translating it rather than it being so forefront. But that's what, as I say, game lit and lit RPGs do. They literally take the game mechanics and turn it into a book.
So it sounds like then what you tend to do, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like what you're saying then is you grab all the elements that you think you're going to want to use. Yeah. And kind of set them up as a scaffold for your story, and then write your story. Is it that they're kind of a background scaffold that you're writing the story around, or is it that they're a collection of elements that you then sprinkle into your story? I guess is the question I have.
I think the scaffolding one's quite accurate.
Okay.
That like when you start off with a new idea, you don't necessarily have an idea where you're going. So for me, it's like, okay, I want to have a story that has these elements as inspired by say this video game here, Skyrim. So I want to have Norse, I want to have swords and stuff. And then as you kind of like, I kind of develop my stories in a spiral way. So it's like I do a little bit of world building here, a little bit of character work there. Here's a little bit of plot. And then as I go round and round, it kind of fleshes out and becomes its own thing. So the 13th Hour isn't exactly Final Fantasy, isn't exactly the Elder Scrolls, but the elements are kind of there, all kind of swirled in like a big pot of paint.
Well, let's dive a little deeper into the elements that you're using for the story. So this scaffold that you've built yourself. How do you go about making it your own? How do you basically you take the dance fighting of Soul Calibur and then apply it in your story without basically how do you avoid being derivative and how do you twist that into your own creation? Well, make it what you want, what you use it how you want to use it.
I suppose it comes down to what I said before about the vibes. I'm just taking the atmosphere and the vibes, and that another author would have a completely different take on it. So it kind of comes down to tropes, I suppose.
I see.
All books are based on particular tropes, and those tropes make its own unique kind of sandwich, so to speak. So we're all kind of taking elements here and there. We're just kind of rearranging it in its own way.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's jump back to our drink here once again. And if you're willing, I'd like to ask you to do a little bit of world building. So can you create for our listeners what you think is the perfect setting for this drink? What's the right mood, the right pairing, the right location? And this could be for you. It could be for a brand new character. It could be from a character or for a character in one of your stories, whatever you want.
Okay, so this being Mango Fiesta, and obviously you being the Mango Loco, has the even the can has the artistic design, which can be you could say it's inspired by Mexican aesthetics. Mm-hmm. It's definitely very Mexican vibed. So you'd probably assume that the obvious choice would be to set it in Mexico, but no. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Energy drinks, to me, have a cyberpunk kind of futuristic vibe to them.
I would definitely agree with that.
And while on the subject, Death Stranding, which is also one of my favorite games, that has Monster Energy drinks as a product placement. You can literally drink Monster Energy drink in that game, and it gives you energy. But I digress. I just love that game. So let's picture the scene. You're in a rundown apartment with rusted tech and wires inside. Outside, neon lights of the city at night are glowing through the rain. Cars are flying past and honking their horns. The smell of leftover chow mein noodles wafts off the table. Your eye catches the glow of a neon palm tree visible from your balcony. Your rent is due, but you're out of cash. So you take a moment to pop open a Monster Energy drink, government standard. Take a refreshing gulp as you imagine yourself sitting on a warm, dry beach with nothing but the sun and sea for company, and no sound except waves and gentle rustle of palm trees. But of course, that's only a dream, and this kind of monster is all you have to keep going for the next job in this damn sea.
Nice. It reminds me a little bit of one of my favorite books ever. Have you ever read Vert by Jeff Noon?
I have not, no.
Oh, it is dark, but it's so good. Anyway, the basic gist of that book is that VR is basically done through drugs.
Ooh.
Yeah, and it's everything that entails.
That sounds cool.
But
it
yeah,
sounds like something that you would definitely like.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely right up my alley.
Aye.
Okay, so without being too spoilery, so we talked a little bit about some of your video game influences. So you talked a little bit about the dance fighting.
Yeah.
Can you give us a few more details from your stories, and it could be any of your stories, that definitely had their roots in video games that maybe some of your readers might not have noticed right off the bat?
Okay, well, in the 13th Hour, there's definitely the elements of Final Fantasy, as I kind of mentioned. There's the magic and technology. mixed together, which is quite a Final Fantasy thing. There's a gods rolling over, which again, Final Fantasy, and the Midgar-inspired plates, Final Fantasy. Fantasy races as well is something that you kind of see in Final Fantasy. Without being too spoilery, there is definitely a god in the story that's very Genova kind of inspired. You kind of meet her towards the end of the book, but we definitely got our own Genova. And I'm kind of thinking in the future sequels, I might kind of have a bit more Final Fantasy inspiration. I'm thinking we're going to have some kind of one-winged angel at some point, but the one wing's going to be like clockwork. So that's going to be a very kind of on-the-nose thing. The steampunk, as I said before, is kind of inspired by the Elder Scrolls. See, when I was playing through Skyrim that one time during the pandemic, I created myself like a Dunmer character, which is like a dark elf character. She was like a dark elf thief, and that character basically became the main character of Kale, who is also like a dark elf inspired kind of character. So there we are. My Vesper are basically Dunmer, just as grumpy as well.
Now, when you're playing games, do you find that you are kind of always putting certain elements that you like in your back pocket to use later while you're writing? Or do you come back to the games once you've started writing to then try to draw that inspiration?
I'd say probably the first time. If I'm playing a game, I could come across an element that I find inspiring. I'm like, oh yeah, that could be kind of cool to put into a story. So I might write down a note and just save it for later. I've got loads of these notes just kind of piled up of just random ideas that I've just taken here and there. I wouldn't say I've ever gone back after a story.
Gotcha.
I just kind of steal the inspiration first.
Well, and this is a question just for my own benefit. Do you have a good organization system for all of those notes? Because I do a very similar thing, just kind of with everything. And it tends to just be like Post-it notes snow in my office. It's the worst.
God, no.
Okay.
God, no. Who does?
Yeah.
I mean, I use OneNote to put all my notes in, but my OneNote is just like a collection of pasted notes everywhere. It has no rhyme or reason. Every now and then I try to organize it, but nah. I'll read through it one day and be like, oh, where did I get that from? What the hell does that mean?
Yeah. It's kind of like the notes people take when they're dreaming.
Yes. That's the same.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you may have come across when it comes to trying to add these elements into your story.
I wouldn't say that I've really come across any challenges other than just trying to fit all of the world building elements together so that they make sense. That's kind of like playing a giant jigsaw puzzle where you've got this here and this there and you have to try and fit it together. But that's just world building in general, I think, where you're just trying to make sense of it all. I've never written, well, I'll say I've never written. I don't write Gamelit. I have attempted to write Gamelit in the past. And Gamelit, if you've ever read it or come across it, it uses a lot of stats and game mechanics and world building mechanics in the story. The character has literal stats on the page for their weapons. And I find that really, really challenging. I'm not sure if I could actually properly do it because I look at numbers and I just scream, to be honest. But I'm sure a Gamelit author could probably shed a bit more light on how difficult that is. But yeah, that looks like a challenge to me. Trying to balance all these stats and things.
Do you have any upcoming video games that you're already kind of eyeing for new inspiration?
Probably Starfield.
Yeah.
Probably Starfield.
Oh, does that mean we're getting a sci-fi book or series in the future?
Maybe. I actually love like watching sci-fi films and playing games that have a sci-fi element. Yeah, I've not really written anything like that yet, but I absolutely would love to. Definitely.
Nice.
In the future.
So are there any aspects of video games that you think don't translate that well into writing?
Well, obviously video games focus more on the game mechanics, and video games that especially focus on those mechanics would probably be a lot harder to translate. For example, Tetris might be a challenge. Mm-hmm. But then I think what makes a good video game to movie adaptation is when you take the world and the vibe of the game and you translate into something that's suitable for a movie. So you're not like taking the whole game, you're taking like the essence of the game. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that you could do for a book. There's quite a few novels out there already that are already based on video games. There's like Halo books, there's Mass Effect books, there's an Elder Scrolls book as well, and there's probably a lot more, probably becoming quite popular. So I think personally, you could take any video game and translate it into a book. Obviously, you're just going to have to do it a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing to stop you from writing a heartwarming tale of teamwork about Rocket League. You absolutely could. It's not going to be exactly the same as the game, but then if you're translating, as I say, the game into a film, it's not going to be exactly the same. But as long as the elements are there that you know and love, then it should feel right. Hopefully.
Okay, so speaking along those lines, are there any details in any of your stories that come from one of those kind of left field video games that people wouldn't necessarily pick up on, like Tetris, or something that doesn't necessarily scream story?
That's a really hard question. I'm not really sure on that one, to be honest.
Okay.
Just thinking about it.
Well, with it's kind of the flip side of the coin of the original question, then, what aspects of video games would you like to see explored more in books?
Okay. So I think I'd like to see more in books side quests, maybe based on characters, like what RPGs and other games do really well. An example from the Outer Worlds as well as Fallout is that you recruit a companion and then you do like a side quest to earn that companion's loyalty, like a loyalty bonus. And that reveals more of their past, of their character, their motivation and their struggle. And I mean, you can't do that with books. But obviously, the books tend to focus on specific characters, like the main character, the antagonist, maybe a couple of side characters. But they don't really go off on a tangent and explore the side characters in a way that video games can. Mm-hmm. But then that's what side stories are for. You could do like a spin-off.
Yeah, I like that. I think you made me think of one element of video games that I think could be really helpful to think about while writing, and that's basically making your characters earn it.
Yeah.
Right. You said earn the side character's trust, or like I feel like sometimes in stories, it's easy to kind of just make things happen.
Oh yeah, I see.
To make the story move along, and that using that kind of necessary struggle that's built into video games, I think could be really helpful in kind of contextualizing and thinking about our own writing.
I'm just thinking that definitely wouldn't really work with romance, because romance storylines in video games, it's like I'll just keep giving them this item until their love goes up. And I'm not sure that would translate one into books.
That's true. It might be a bit straightforward and repetitive. Nice. So what sort of tips and tricks and advice would you give someone who wants to start pulling some inspiration from video games for their own work?
Play more games, definitely. Seriously, I'd recommend playing adventure, action, or RPG games and paying attention to the atmosphere of those games, how the game uses sight, sound, and feedback to kind of create the atmosphere. Because obviously games, they do a lot of work in the background that you might not necessarily pay attention to, that then creates the kind of world, it creates the atmosphere. And that's what games do best. So if you kind of pay attention to those details and see what exactly do these details tell about the world and the people or creatures that are living in that world.
One question I had for you was, were there any details from a video game that you really, really wanted to work into your story, but either didn't make the cut or that you found were a bit too tricky to incorporate?
I'm not entirely sure if there's any details that I haven't included.
Okay, nice.
Obviously, I've included certain elements that I think fit. I mean, when you're kind of building a world, not everything's necessarily going to go into that world anyway. It kind of has to make some kind of coherent sense, unless you're writing something completely crazy, which, to be fair, my book kind of is a little bit already. So, I mean, the 13th Hour has all of these different random fancy races, and like 12 different unique races that all have their own powers, and it's like, who's nuts enough to do that? Like, it's a lot of work. And
It's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. I mean, some people did find it kind of confusing that there's just so many things going on, all of these different worlds and things, and it's like, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that. But
it makes sense.
It would work for an MMO, probably. Maybe not for a book, but I somehow manage.
Yeah, I mean, it's like watching a juggler. You know, if you can juggle 2 balls, great. If you can juggle 12, juggle 12. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's great to see. So if you can pull it off, definitely go for it. What was the hardest part about juggling that many races in the story?
I think it's just trying to convey what they are to the reader so it's not too overwhelming. But again, it's the same with any kind of world building, that if you throw everything at the front and at the start, then you're going to completely overwhelm the reader. You've got to kind of like drip it through, feed it through a little bit, just maybe focus on a couple at a time and then introduce them as you're going through, which you would do for any other kind of world building, really, so you don't completely overwhelm the reader or confuse them.
Now, you talked a little bit about world building and about characters, but I'm curious, did video games inspire any of the races, kind of as a whole within your story?
I would say definitely yes. I mentioned that the Vesper are based off the Dunmer. I've got a high elf kind of inspired race. Some of these inspired by video games, some of them a little bit by Dungeons and Dragons, but then Dungeons and Dragons are the original video games, so it all kind of makes sense there. Just looking at the map that I've got now, trying to think. Some of them I think are kind of like traditional races that I just kind of worked myself. Mm-hmm. Some of them just kind of popped out of nowhere.
All right, Trudie. Well, it is last call here at the Indie Pub. Can you give us an indie published book or 2 or 3 or more that you want more people to check out?
Yes. Is there a limit to this? Because I've got a few.
No limit. No limit. Go for it.
Okay, well, while we're talking about video games, I kind of wanted to mention like LitRPG games, because obviously they explore game elements at the forefront in a way that other books don't. So LitRPGs and game lit books are becoming massively popular now. So if you're interested in a book that actually incorporates these game elements directly off the bat, straight on the page, then I'd recommend checking out authors like Alex Raizman, James T. Callum, Wong, Tracy Gregory, and Wight, who also do cultivation type books, which is basically taking video games and the leveling up system into a book, just translating it. So if that kind of thing interests you, those authors are definitely ones to check out. I want to recommend a couple of indie books that share similarities to the 13th Hour. So if you like grim, dark, gaslamp fantasy, you might like Legacy of the Brightwash by Krystle and Matar, We Men of Ash and Shadow by H.L. Tinsley, both of which are Spiffbo finalists this year. If you like more whimsical fantasy of manners, then I recommend checking out The Lord of Stariel by A.J. Lancaster, or Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons by Quenby Olsen, which is really good, all kind of like Gaslampy. It's a little bit self-indulgent as well, but I also want to bring up Radio by your good self.
Oh, well, thank you.
Because one of the reasons why I picked up Radio is because it features a godlike being trapped inside someone else's head, and that instantly interested me, because it's like, that's what I'm writing about. I'm writing about gods that speak inside their minds, and it's like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. So that kind of trope really interests me. I mean, our stories couldn't be more different, honestly, but I love the whole gods playing around with mortals. It's always kind of fun to explore that trope.
Just as a side question, speaking of that, did you find it as hard as I did to figure out how to deal with the speech within heads?
I literally read your book to figure that out.
Okay, because I spent so much time trying to figure out how to pull that off.
I use your book as kind of like inspiration for that, so there we go.
Oh, great. Okay, well, that's good.
Because I was stumped by that as well. Oh, shit, how are you going to do this?
Oh, yeah, that was a struggle. That was definitely a struggle. All right, well, then same question, but for any other media, indie or not, what do you think people need to be checking out right now?
Okay, well, sticking to the theme of video games, there's like lots of gaming adaptations in film and TV right now. On Netflix, you've got Castlevania, The Witcher, technically, it's a game. But I really, really have to recommend Arcane.
Yeah.
which is based on the world from League of Legends. And some people kind of get put off by that because of the reputation that League of Legends has for its kind of toxic fan base. But Arcane is honestly such a masterpiece of animation, character work, story. The world building is quite similar to mine as well. I mean, have you watched Arcane?
Yes.
It's amazing.
We've been really bad about it's kind of we'll watch an episode and get really excited and then get distracted and then wait a while and then so I think we have one more episode to watch, but it has been absolutely fantastic.
Oh, you need to watch it, man.
I know. It's just getting my butt in the chair to do it, but
it's fantastic. It really is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I haven't played League of Legends, but I get that it's. I'm glad that you brought that one up because it is such a good example of the inspired by without necessarily just being the thing. It's not like the Mortal Kombat movies or something like that where it's like you play Mortal Kombat and then here's a movie.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh, have you seen the Mortal Kombat film, the latest one?
I think so. It was definitely, I thought, better than some of the older ones. Well,
I loved the older one, but the newer one I thought was quite terrible.
It was not good. It was not good. Yeah, I don't know. I like elements of both, and then I hate elements of both. I don't know. I'm a '90s kid, so the nostalgia, of course, of the old one is there. But
I mean, I love the Street Fighter film, and that's
with the Raul Julia one.
Yeah, but I mean, that's amazing, but it's also not amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing for the wrong reasons, but I love that film.
Yeah. I haven't watched that one. I haven't watched any Jean-Claude Van Damme in a really long time, but I should probably rectify that. All right, Trudie, tell our listeners where they can find you and your work and what you have going on right now.
I'm currently working on a sequel to the 13th Hour, which is named The Children of Chaos. I'm aiming to release that this summer, but an audiobook version of the 13th Hour is coming out soon. You can find more about me and my books on my website, which is TrudieSkies.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at Trudie Skies.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.